And what you find happening is that things are not blooming quite when they used to be. So some of the things that I would have expected in my own garden to bloom in April, by the latest April, for instance, didn't bloom till July. Um, so there has been that sort of throwing out of sync of the seasons. If you extrapolate that to farmers who tend to have, a lot of the Jamaican farmers are going by the month of the year
Seasons.
and the typical seasons to guide them when to plant, when to set up their crops. And when these things happen, it's very off-putting. It throws them because it's not business as usual. My name is Thera Edwards, and I'm a lecturer and the map curator in the Department of Geography and Geology in the Faculty of Science and Technology at the University of the West Indies Mona campus. I have been working in the environment now for roughly 30 years. My first degree is in environmental sciences, and I have a master's in environmental management. What has happened is that over time, the need for doing work in climate studies, climate change, and more recently, climate justice has become more of an imperative. I remember in my earlier years, when this whole thing about climate change started, I was like, everybody's jumping on climate change. I'm not going there. I'm sticking to my botany and my environmental sciences, um, biodiversity work, forestry, forest ecology. And then as time progressed, I realized that, as they say, climate change is everybody's business. It is intersecting with everything. So if it's agriculture and farming, it's changing up weather. It's dictating that farmers might be selecting for crops that are drought resistant, or for crops that in some cases might be able to tolerate extreme weather events, whether it be lots of rainfall or storms. And then if it was my work in ecology, forest ecology or biodiversity, I realized that species distribution was changing with climate. As it got hotter, some of the lower altitude areas that may have experienced cooler temperatures were now experiencing warming, and that there was some species shift according to what we would say are altitude gradients. And it just went on to then, by 2020, I was approached to join a project called Recipes for Resilience, working with Caribbean youth across the region, as well as what was termed Afro-descendant youth in the UK, looking at food and food systems, food supply, their connections to the West Indies, the Caribbean, through food memory with, parents, grandparents. And out of that project, that's where the real spark was ignited around climate justice, because of the differential impacts of climate and climate change. And having not worked actively with botanical research for some time, I was pulled back into my roots, so to speak. My PhD work was in the Blue Mountains, started out as forest ecology along the Vinegar Hill Trail, and expanded out to a more landscape level look at change over time. But I began to revisit botanical work, remembering some of the conversations I had with the farmers who used to help me go out to do my field studies, or what I saw happening then, or the rural communities of the Blue Mountains as I had traveled around. And so it's a sort of a coming full circle, but a necessary full circle.
Mm. Interesting. You mentioned how plants are affected at different heights,
Altitudes, yes.
altitudes, depending on climate change or warming can affect them in different ways and cause. You're saying maybe you can help me to finish, but plants essentially moving or
So there will be a shift.
mhm,
So for instance, if you take the Blue Mountains, which is my most familiar space,
mhm,
I mean, I've gone across the island, Hellshire Hills, Dolphin Head, Cockpit Country, but the
mhm,
Blue Mountains are my baby, so to speak. And if you look, there's something called the Mason-Rebound effect or mass elevation effect that you experience in tropical mountains, tropical island mountains, where because of the landmass of the mountains and the proximity to the coast, you have what's called like a telescoping effect. So you would find forests that are very similar to almost temperate forests, but montane forests. The species that you're finding, the mosses, um, your bryophytes, your ferns,
mhm,
um, and the forest is very reminiscent of this temperate look.
mhm.
And it's all because of the rapid altitude gradient that you go up the mountain, but it's not far inland. It's very
Still,
close,
yeah.
right? So what you find is that some of the species that you would have had recorded at lower altitudes are now being found higher up
Mhm,
because the temperature has warmed. You're finding that shift also with not just with plants, but animals, birds,
mhm,
frogs, other species that are shifting in terms of where their distribution is. If you're having extended dry periods,
mhm.
um, plant and animal species that are going to want or require a certain amount of moisture are going to also be driven to other spaces, locations because of that shift. So there's that biodiversity effect.
That's interesting because recently I visited it's a reserve between Clarendon and St. Mary. I'm trying to remember the name.
Um, you're talking Mason River.
Mason River
So the
Protected
Mason River
Area.
protected area,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah,
It's
actually,
also a wetland of international importance.
and I found that actually where, so maybe you can speak to this a little bit, that even in spaces, even in a space like that where it is a wetland and where a wetland typically is kind of like a haven, especially during dry periods, like the wetlands, in some sense, is experiencing, a, it's still wet relative compared to other places around.
But not as wet as it used to
Used to
be.
be, exactly.
Exactly, right.
And I noticed the plants are being affected because of that. I found like even the person that kind of curates and the warden of the space was telling me that things like orchid and stuff like that that used to be available more like for a longer period throughout the year, it's like you're only seeing it for a smaller period. What have you noticed in spaces like that, wetlands, in particular, and that shift?
So that happens.
Like mangroves as well, you know.
There's several kinds of shifts.
Mhm,
I can Okay, so I live in the lower part of the Blue Mountains,
mhm,
Port Royal Mountains area. And this year, there are certain things that you observe annually.
mhm,
You know it's finally warm when you hear the cicadas
mhm,
start to sound off. Or you have certain plants in your garden, whether it be an orchid or a lily, that are blooming, March or April. Or coming down to this end of the year, there's a bright yellow flower that you find along the roadsides as you go up um, along the road towards Newcastle. The common name is parrot's gold.
mhm.
when you see the pirate's gold start to bloom, you know it's cooling off. We're approaching, Christmas, the end of year, the cool season. And what you find happening is that things are not blooming quite when they used to be. So some of the things that I would have expected in my own garden to bloom in April, by the latest April, for instance, didn't bloom till July. So there has been that sort of throwing out of sync of the seasons. If you extrapolate that to farmers who tend to have, a lot of the Jamaican farmers are going by the month of the year
Seasons.
and the typical seasons to guide them when to plant, when to set up their crops. And when these things happen, it's very off-putting. It throws them because it's not business as usual. In March of this year, I was in the Rio Grande Valley, and a farmer, not quite, I would say middle-aged, was bemoaning that there was a particular variety of corn. And he said it was basically end of March, 1st of April corn. And no one in the community had that corn. He asked around and he asked around, and he eventually got one ear, and that was what he sowed, hoping to get a few stalks planted out in his farm. And so you have this impact on farmers who are going by seasonality. And we may talk about, working with farmers and science and technology and going with the times. But we have to recognize that we still have a large number of farmers who still use traditional approaches, what we might call in or academic space, indigenous technical knowledge. They're going by what they know through customary practice. And we have to, parts of climate justice has to recognize what these changes mean for them and their traditional approach to planting and seasonality. Even for, as I think, and follow my thoughts, in the Blue Mountains, again, the coffee farmers are having different timings for when they're seeing flowering and fruiting and when they're able to harvest coffee. You might have coffee coming in at a time that is inconvenient, so to speak, because it's in the hardest part of the rainy season and it's difficult to get people on those slopes to harvest. Or it's not, things are just not happening when they need to. And it's not just about heavy rain. Sometimes, as you've asked when you prompted me, it can be drought. 1 year, a farmer I knew said he casually said it, but I think it was just trying to make light of the situation he was in, his plight, was I'm running pipe by the mile because the rains had not come. It was a traditionally wet enough area, light, soft rain, mist even, and it was a very dry year. And to save his coffee crop, he was buying irrigation hosing by the mile, he said, to save his crop. So, we have all of this happening. The changes in temperature by altitude, the extended unseasonable droughts. Then you have, a year like the one we've had for us. And I've learned that it's not like this across the island in the Blue Mountain space, where it has been an exceptionally wet year. It rains almost every day.
Interesting. There's that too, where well, and then when the effect of when it does rain for some places that have been dry for a long period, it doesn't get to, we don't get too much absorption going on. It's more erosion and that kind of thing.
So after you've not had, if you've had an extended dry season, you can have what we call crusting happening with the soil, and it forms an impermeable surface where it's hard for the water to percolate and go through down below the surface. And that brings its own problems. Or if you've had this prolonged drought and the rain comes and it's heavy and it's not a sort of a gentle, soft first set of rain, then you do get erosion, because then the material is loose and crummy, and the rain is digging it off. So then the erosion sets in. And then that's another whole conversation we could have about rivers, turbidity, and what's washing into our coastal waters.
Yeah, that's another big issue as well. I thought this one would be interesting because you just mentioned the farmers. Most of our farmers were, for instance, I was educated in some aspects in agriculture. And I think that's, I wouldn't say fairly new, because I know case has been around for quite some time. I know a few people who have gone there, but for the most part, even in the sense of where farming has become or has been for a lot of people, just the easier way for them to survive and to eat and that kind of thing. A lot of that knowledge has been very traditional. Your work emphasizes the importance of traditional knowledge in ethnobotany in addressing climate change. Can you explain or just share from what you know how indigenous communities' deep understanding of local plants and their use can contribute to climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies?
All right. So first of all, we have a lot of, whether it be varieties of plants, of agricultural plants, whether, in the case of the corn I mentioned, or we have types of chocho, yams, pumpkin, even red peas. If you go in the supermarkets, you notice there's a dark, roundish red peas, not the sort of rose pink red peas that we would typically have. So we find that in trying to shift towards the balance with production or making economic gains, there are traditional varieties that we're losing. And some of these varieties were well adapted for our cycles of drought and or dry and wet. I don't want to use drought all the time because it doesn't have to be extreme, because we do go through those cycles of dry and wet. It also might have to do with the kind of open field. Do we require some amount of shade or not shade? There have been some farmers who have adopted greenhouse technology, a few even moving towards hydroponics to plant things like lettuce versus open field. And it's been said that, okay, climate resilience, you can use greenhouses because if heavy rains come, your crops aren't battered. But as we begin to, and I'm not setting up old versus new. I'm trying to find a space where both can coexist. Because what happened was, in your older farming systems, you had layers. You had a tree layer. So, you were having your breadfruit, your ackee, pear trees, maybe mango. And then you had another layer with maybe your gungo peas, cassava, corn, and other sort of middle level. And then you had your ground level plants. So you had your things like your pumpkin on the ground, You had other things that were going underground, your tuber crops.
Yeah, man.
And you had small patches of herbs, seasonings. And so the trees were, into some extent, breaking the impact of the rain. And then you had, things in that vertical arrangement, were either shading where you needed shade,
Like a
and
natural canopy.
right. And then you would have some things which were light demanding being more exposed, but you would certainly have things arranged where they were beneficial to each other. And you would have had a greater variety. So the farmers would have had their own food production area for their household, and they would have had the area where they were growing things for sale, for profit. And so you had this whole system. And what you're finding now is that they are, to some extent, pretty specialized. They're not growing that wide selection of crops. And there's nothing wrong in using market analysis, because we've had some very sad instances of crops having to rot in the field because of gluts.
Yeah.
So nothing wrong with market analysis, working with Ministry of Agriculture, working with RADA Extension. But we are in some ways losing that resilience with the diversity of the farm, having multiple crops that would, address household consumption as well as production for sale,
Yeah.
and family profit.
Interesting.
And that sets up food insecurity sometimes, because you can, believe it or not, you can have farmers who are food insecure.
The farmers, and how they're affected by like beryl. In particular, banana and plantain, where we're seeing shortage and that kind of thing. And it just makes me think about how things like climate change affecting what we produce versus what we consume, and how that's in some ways forcing us to import a lot more foods. And I imagine that might be affecting, like you said, the production of some of the things that we used to farm a lot more in variety that may be more climate resilient. Would you say that is the case?
There are, it's never quite a simple answer. So I teach a course, Tropical Land Management, and for the past 2 years, I've been taking the students into different agroecological zones. So the island has this zoning according to wet, dry, very wet, and whether the agriculture tends to be rain-fed or irrigation. So we start out in the Bernard Lodge area with a farmer who's in the dry ecological zone and uses irrigation water. And then we go into Upper Clarendon, Mid Clarendon. So we're going Kellits, Grantham, Kilsyth areas to farms. And especially in Clarendon, the farmers were just saying, they're just getting back up. They're trying. One of the greatest problems they were having, beryl came in early July. They had, and as I said, it's been a very wet year for some places. The places that that experience rainfall have been having very continuous rainfall. And weeds, the farms were overrun with weeds. And so getting the farm cleared, prepped, beds ready, things out was actually a challenge this year. One farmer who leased a small part of his land to another farmer was apologizing and said, boy, that's not how I do my business. But he acknowledged that the other farmer was doing the best he could, because if he had taken more time in land preparation versus actually getting the crop in the ground, he would be missing the Christmas sales. So he had to make a decision that if I don't plant now, I will not be harvest anything to catch sales for the Christmas. Yes. And so these are the things that happen to the farmers. They had the heavy crop losses in July with beryl, and then they would have to clean and prepare and start again. One farmer just took a break. He said he had a little bit of, I would say, buffering financial coverage, personal financial coverage, and he just took a vacation, because, you know, it was like at this point, and based on what I would normally be doing, it didn't make sense to go right back in just now. So he took a break for the rest of the summer, and he was now getting the land ready again late September, October, and planting, putting up, you know, shade houses for seedlings, that sort of thing. I don't know if that kind of...
Yeah, definitely gets into the question. All right, so why do you think it's so crucial to preserve and protect the biodiversity in the face of climate change? And what would you think are some of the most effective strategies now, based on the work that you've been doing?
All right, so for biodiversity, there are so many dimensions to it. There is biodiversity. I'm okay still? Yeah, so there's biodiversity. There's agrobiodiversity, which I think we've been focused on for most of the conversation. What we're seeing on the farms, the varieties of plants. I have to give a mention to my colleague Sylvia Mitchell, who's been doing a lot of work with Yampi and propagation and getting it back out onto farms, as something that was disappearing.
Yampi,
it's a small soft yam that traditionally comes in for Christmas. One of our little specialized seasonal things, you know, like how we have sorrel for Christmas. Then it's one of the things that Yampi comes in at the end of the year. But again, yellow yam is your big export market thing, and we can have a danger in sometimes in catering for export, where other culturally important things disappear. I don't know what it was like for you going to school, but when I think of the fruits that we used to be able to get from at school sold to us, or things we used to eat. Earlier this year, I was speaking with another team about stinking toe. Now more popularized for making a punch, but it was something that we used to crack and open and eat as children. Or sweet cups. We used to get sweet cups to crack open. I don't see sweet cup anymore.
No, that's something that I've been wondering about. At a certain point, I was wondering if I made it up as a child.
No, this little yellow hard.
It's similar to
passion fruit, but you had smaller, raw, and very sweet. Same family, but where's sweet cup? Or you know, so you're like, where are these things that we used to eat? I saw on Twitter recently somebody saying, does anybody know about stewing June plums? And, you know, there was this whole discussion about stewed June plum. And I'm like, yeah, it was a thing. And so it's not only having the fruit or the crop, it's also about traditional preparation. So the Caribbean Food for Climate justice research group that I'm a part of. It's
Yes, interesting.
UK and Caribbean researchers, both academia and independent scholars. We have been looking at foods, not just growing them, but how they fit into climate justice, how they fit into climate resilience. And so whether it be desserts, drinks, savory dishes with meat, seasonings that we would use, we're trying to hold on to some traditions because they're going.
Mm-hmm.
If the crops are not being grown and they're not coming into the house, then the food is not being prepared and the recipes are not being seen by the next generation and passed on, you know. So that's another whole dimension of the cultural significance of the work and tying into people and memory.
I'm very interested in that because even you guys together deciding from the research that you're doing that it's important to put together something like this. What was the thought that went into it? Because as you mentioned, some of this stuff a lot of it is not being seen again. We're not passing down a lot of this stuff. There was a point where a lot of it was passed down orally, but a lot of that is changing. So what was the thought that went into it at the time, based on the research that the group was doing, that inspired you guys to put together this book?
Well, it started out with the first project, Recipes for Resilience, with the youth in the UK and the youth in the Caribbean. And we had them talk to their parents and grandparents about traditional recipes and how their meals had changed, or how the meals in the UK were different from the meals in the Caribbean, or even with the Caribbean youth, how were their meals becoming more aligned to, say, American or English dietary patterns versus Caribbean dietary patterns. And then after we had that project, we decided to go for another research grant, and that was called the Ancestral Gardens Project. It has a longer name, but just use a short name, Ancestral Gardens. And so we decided to work in collaboration with the 4-H Club movement. And we also were working with the Taino hummingbird people, the Kasikiani, about traditional foods, crops. And out of that, we had some workshops, and we said, okay, we were just talking, and it came out of the workshops as well that people were saying, I don't see this anymore, or I remember that. And I remember eating this meal prepared by my grandmother, or we used to have this at Easter or Christmas. And we said, we need to capture this. It's going and going fast. So it's not just a cookbook as in recipes. There are climate boxes. There are boxes about how to grow the things, because sometimes people don't know, like, okay, how do I get this? How do I get this in my yard? And then the actual recipes, and whether for some reason it's a climate winner or a loser based on its impact. So even with my students in October, when we went to Clarendon, the last farm we went to, I saw a bird pepper. And I remember as a child, every yard had a bird pepper bush near the kitchen, and you used to put bird peppers in your pot. Bird peppers are almost, I don't want to use the word extinct, but I almost feel like they're nearing there, because that farmer said she went somewhere and got a few, and she has planted it, and that's how she has it. And it goes on, where we have to, when you see seeds or you see a plant, you get a cutting or you get some seeds and you set it, and you're trying to have it for yourself.
That's interesting, because I think I always think about when I speak to experts like yourself, who are both you're living the reality, but you're also studying it. And it makes me it makes me think about people, regular people who might not be aware of, because when you do a research, when you get a research grant to do something like this, now you're able to specify, you have the support, and it's a group of people, and you're able to kind of look at what's going on and see the results of things that are changing. But I think regular people, they don't have access to much of this information. They might think that they might not see the importance. They might not think it's that big a deal. What would you kind of say to people who this conversation may not have been broached with them at all, like how important it is to remember some of this stuff, to pass down some of this stuff, and to even support and purchase and keep and pass down literature like what you guys have produced that helps us to preserve it.
It's very important, and there are several things you can do. Last week, there was a fire safety and awareness expo in Gordon Town. It was National Fire Safety and Awareness Week. We partnered with the community, partnered with the Jamaica Fire Brigade and other government organizations, NEPA, National Solid Waste Management Authority, Red Cross. And I did a little booth, a little display. Call it a display, not really a full booth. And a demonstration with primary school students on how to compost. Why did composting fit into fire awareness? Because a lot of people, when they clean their yards, they burn the trash. What I was putting to them, that if you use your leaves, your grass cuttings, the peels, the skins, the pulp, your tea bags, and so on from your kitchen and put it all together, then you can compost and use the compost in your garden as a natural amelioration to improve your soil fertility.
Irrigation and stuff too, yeah.
So I was doing that. And so what happens is that it's making it easy for people to access information. And so I like when I do the projects that I've been doing, because then the information becomes accessible. So for Recipes for Resilience, we have a website. On that website, we talk about how a lot of the foods that are familiar in our space, coconut, breadfruit, ackee, how they came. We explore other global foods like corn and wheat, and do contrasts with those food systems. And so the website is full of information, presentations, PowerPoints, videos from the workshops. And of course, we used ArcGIS story maps to have story maps online that people could read about all these foods. So it's a resource. The successor follow-on project, Ancestral Gardens, our legacy, apart from setting up demonstration gardens like at Lauriston at the 4-H club site, is this cookbook. But it's not just a cookbook. It's really, I would say it's a full resource book. We've called it a cookbook, but it's so much more. And we're showing people not just how to prepare the foods, because they may have never seen them, but how to grow them, because that's important. I think it's also important as we become more urbanized in townhouses and apartment buildings of many floors, to show people that you can also do container gardening.
Interesting.
Small space gardening, especially things like tomatoes, cucumber, peppers. There are quite a few things that can be grown with very small space. So you can still be producing without having a full yard. But if you have a yard, then you're even in a better position.
Yeah, agreed fully. So even as you mentioned that, I thought it might be interesting for our listeners to. Some of us might know some of these plants and use them, but we might not know. Like, even as you said, contrasting some of the plants that we have here to more global plants. and what are probably some of the results you find, and what are maybe some plants that we're familiar with that maybe we should pay more attention to because they do have more resilience to climate change in contrast to maybe more global crops. And it's not to say we shouldn't grow global crops at all, but I think people would maybe appreciate like maybe an elevator list of some of these plants that we might look into.
Cassava comes to mind.
Mm-hmm.
We have both bitter and sweet cassava. The bitter cassava is the one that's normally, washed and prepared and made into bami. We have sweet cassava, which can be boiled. It makes a beautiful dessert, a pone. That's in the book. Sweet cassava pone recipe is there.
That I found, I actually, my had a great grandnephew had a cassava farm, and I noticed that as well. He didn't see as well. He couldn't see as well in his later years, but the farm was almost like he planted it and it was fine. Like in terms of irrigation and stuff, it seemed like it didn't struggle as much as other crops. Would you say that is the case?
It is pretty hardy, and because it's short stature, and of course it's underground. So for you to get the tubers out, so it's not going to be, say, like a banana that's above ground on a soft stem, which is going to blow over. So again, quite resilient, culturally significant, or first people, the Tainos, major part of their mainstay of their diet. So very important. We have foods that are, there might be restricted in terms of where they're available, but also important. I think we need to remember foods that were important to other culturally significant groups, like Kakun to the Maroons. Kakun is another food that you have to rinse out, having running water to make safe for consumption, but it's something that the Maroons prepare and cook down.
Trying to figure out which one that is. Kakun.
I don't know if you ever heard
of the name
of the, like, I think they used to call it a fifi, the thing you pull. That used to whir. You used to be able to buy it as a little it was a toy I had, and locally made toy with the shells of the bean. So it's a large pod that grows in wet areas near rivers, streams, perhaps as long as a meter. Very big.
It was a fruit. I think I've seen them make jewelry with it.
Right, maybe a big center pendant. So then the inner part of that can be cooked. We have hearts of palm. Way back, I think when Edward Seago was prime minister, he had tried to do something around cultural, about cultivating hearts of palm on a large scale. That was something I had in a salad.
Those are small fruits.
No, not fruits. They within the palm, the stem of the palm itself.
Okay.
But it has to be sustainably done, So things like that. Maca fat is another. I don't know. It's not really a crop, but there are just so many things that we are losing. For the crops, I think it's not so much to name something, but to look more at the variety, because it's in the varieties that we are losing the diversity. If I was to make a big flip away from food and crops, I think it's about habitat preservation. We need to look at where we're losing. You talked about going to Mason River and what was happening there. We've had the Jamaican iguana as a success story, where they found remnant population in the Hellshire Hills and have managed through captive breeding to bring back the species from the brink of extinction. But if you follow another story of the year, where we had a preserved specimen of the giant gallywasp brought back to Jamaica, where it had been in a museum in Scotland in a jar. This was a an animal that was found in Jamaica a long time ago. The specimen was collected here. We haven't seen one in a long time. They're not quite ready to call it extinct. They use the term presumed extinct because there are some places near to the Black Morass area that they feel may just have some still living, but they have not done an extensive or detailed enough search to find it. And so we have um, other species, frogs. We have a lot of endemic frogs in Jamaica. And we have frogs where, again, presumed extinct, thought to be extinct, endangered because they require healthy forests. They need good coverage, for habitat. And, as we develop, as climate change expresses its effects and we lose these optimal conditions, we have these species which become threatened. So, the work is done. I have colleagues in life sciences who are doing work on forests, on different species, looking at where they are and how good the health of the populations are, range and health of population. But we have to be mindful that there are these changing habitat conditions are having an impact on the various species populations.
as well. All right, so I have two final questions. One of the back of that animal biodiversity point, which is that, and this could be, maybe this you could debunk this if it's true or not, but it's one of those Twitter questions, or maybe a rumination. Someone mentioned that they remember back in the day while driving, across Jamaica, or in certain areas that may have been more rural, they had a lot more issues with like insects and bugs on windscreens and that kind of thing, as opposed to now when you're driving and you're almost seeing none of that. And some people have replied and said that had a lot to do with biodiversity. I think some of that may be maybe human doing it, in the sense of we do a lot of fumigating and stuff, but would you say that that is something that maybe science has noticed too locally, where there's a reduction um, in I guess you could call it insect species, in terms of biodiversity?
Can't speak definitively to that. I haven't been doing the work in the area to say what changes there are. That's something I haven't done work yet.
Yeah, okay. Understand. All right, so and the final question that I would have is this: we spoke about how climate change affects ethnobotany, and most of what we did some agriculture, spoke about some agriculture as well. A lot of the plants and crops that we spoke about are on land. I wanted to ask a bit about marine stuff, if you have study and expertise on that. Mangroves in particular, I'd like to get your perspective on that. But also other things like, as you mentioned, habitat, corals, as a habitat for our fish, and how that's affecting, just fish in general, fish population, and the diversity there.
All right, so I'll start with corals just because it's a little more fresh in my mind, having thought something about that yesterday. So one of the problems we're having now is we're having warmer sea temperatures. And corals are very sensitive to sea temperatures. And we've had, so basically we go by looking at the maximum average temperature, which has been established over time. And if you go just about 1 degree Celsius above that maximum average temperature, you are beginning to approach what is called bleaching threshold. And if you have several weeks, and we call them degree heating weeks, of temperatures at that higher than average, you can have the corals, which are really a symbiotic relationship of species. You can have them having expel, they expel when it gets hot, the zooanthely, and you get bleaching. So instead of having a colored pink, orange, whatever color that they normally are, they appear white. Now, if the high temperature period is not too extended, then there can be recovery. But if it is an extended period of time where the degree heating weeks are exceeded for a significantly long period of time, the coral will die. That coral reef area can also then get overgrown by algae, and you are having a dead section of reef which becomes susceptible to things like heavy waves when we have storms or other events, and they break away, they get damaged, they're not offering the coastal protection that they would normally have. Mangroves, coral reefs, and seagrass beds work together, sort of like a trinity, to protect the coastal environments. So we need all of them together. And it's not necessarily where, okay, I have 2 out of 3, it's kind of okay. You need to have all of them together to have the total protection for the coastal ecosystem. Your mangroves, again, sensitive to sea surface, or not the sea surface, but sea temperatures. When I say sea surface, I don't mean right at the surface. I mean the upper part of the column. They also can be quite sensitive to temperature. You're going to be seeing shifts in species distribution, health, alterations in the what we call the physiochemical conditions of the mangrove area, especially for the seaward mangroves, the red mangroves. They get impacted.
Yeah.
So they're marine effects as well, that are happening, and so it's not just only pollution. They often say, oh, it's pollution brought out by the rivers that's causing the problem with the coral reefs. We have a real problem with hot temperatures that we're having in the seas, in the oceans, and coral bleaching. We're also having ocean acidification. So there are several expressions of the climate problem, not just on land, but at sea, in the marine space.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. That's why it's important to share and to kind of, because I spoke to Dr. Michael
Taylor, Professor Michael Taylor.
Yes, Professor Michael Taylor, and yeah, he was kind of sharing a bit about the physics of the climate attribution science and that kind of thing. So a lot of this, like you said, it is really all of our business, and it really is a wider conversation that you kind of need everybody to be a part of. is there anything that maybe we haven't spoken about that you would like to share that you're working on, and or that you have worked on, and what are you working on now or looking to work on?
My research interests remain pretty broad. My newest project is looking at sustainable, healthy, active lifestyles. It's the SHAL project. It's a long-term project, and it's looking at non-communicable diseases. And we are working with youth in Jamaica, but there's also a parallel group looking at the same age group in Canada. So a little more on health research, but there are interconnections through looking at agriculture, food, the global food supply, how it has expressed itself in dietary choices, and what it means for the burden of non-communicable diseases like diabetes, hypertension, and spin-offs like things like when persons develop um, uh, they get maybe kidney problems, they are having heart attacks, they're getting strokes as the extreme, end of having things such as diabetes and hypertension, or they get problems with their eyes. There's a lot of issues with eyes and persons who are diabetic. We have a lot of amputations in Jamaica from persons who have had long-term diabetes issues. Not gonna get into that. I'm more my involvement in that is looking at the environments of the communities that we're studying and where people live, and things like where they live, their opportunities for spaces to go walking, exercise, or places for them to engage in active movement. So that's one of my new horizons. I'm also interested in climate from a historical perspective, with Professor Edward Robinson. I've looked at Carlisle Bay in Clarendon from the 1700s to the present, looking at changes in the coastline, sea level rise in that particular coastal area, the Rio Minnow as a river system coming out at Carlisle Bay, so the lower stretches of the Rio Minnow. And we've done some work, done some publications, still doing work on that. So different things that I remain involved in. But they have common threads.
Yeah, that's what I noticed.
Whether it's climate and how climate expresses itself in one way or another.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you so much again for your time.